I just want to start by welcoming you all to the discussion. And I also wanted to make a quick housekeeping note, a reminder that the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen is open and available for any questions that you might have along the way. Before we get into the substance of the conversation, Sam, I want to start with you. First of all, congratulations. It's a really phenomenal piece of work. I've seen it now multiple times, and I pick up something new every time through. So for those who are seeing this for the first time, do go back because it's worth seeing again and again. But Sam, I wanted to talk to you about where the genesis of this project came from. You know, why this project? Why now? Talk to me a bit about the making of the film.
You'd think after 3 years of this, I'd know how to do it, but still no. Tony, thank you very much. Thank you to the panel for SIPA for working with us on this event, and of course, this audience for tuning in. Yeah, I mean, this was, it was actually an idea that came from our executive director, Irene Brom, and I said, yeah, that's a fantastic idea, and here's why I had that reaction. This is actually something I studied as a master's student, but it wasn't in Europe, it was in Latin America. I did my master's degree around 2010, and at that point, it was like, wow, China has developed this model in Africa, and look, here it is in Latin America. And there's some good sides to it that suddenly these countries that really need development financing have it and can build some of these things. And there's some really concerning sides around it, around labor rights, around the implications to democracy. Then we come here 10 years later and it says, hey, look at this thing that was happening in Africa and then is happening in Latin America is now happening in Southeast Europe. And he said, this is a really important trend and one that we need to understand, especially, you know, I think that there's this shared idea, and sometimes it seems more like an idea than a reality, but there's a conception of what we stand for in the West, in Europe and the United States. And this model that doesn't necessarily coincide with what in theory we stand for, if not in practice, is getting closer and closer and more prevalent and maybe more and more appealing to certain leaders. So it's important that we understand it. And so that's why I thought, I mean, especially the Bertelsmann Foundation, for folks not familiar with us, you know, we're primarily interested in issues of transatlantic relations. This was really a topic that we thought was important to address. And, you know, something that I also want to make sure I say up front, because it's such a politicized and complicated moment, that this is not meant to be seen as some sort of attack on Chinese people in any way whatsoever. And it's not even necessarily to say what's happening in some ways is entirely bad. We say there's some good elements here. It is to say that China is a global superpower and that's manifesting in activities around the world. And just as we have to very carefully analyze, you know, what the United States does or the European Union and criticize when it's due, that we need to be able to have that same conversation to what's happening with China's international policy. So that's why we thought this was a very important and timely question to discuss.
Thanks for kicking that off for us, Sam. What I want to do before we get into the substance of the topic at hand, I wanted to go around the horn to all of our speakers and just get your initial reaction to the film. Anything that stuck out in your mind, any other comments you'd like to make? Anna, I'd like to start with you if you don't mind.
Thank you, Tony, and it's really a pleasure to be here tonight because it's already evening in Central and Eastern Europe. And congratulations to Sam for the excellent work that you've done. I consider myself to be a China scholar, working mostly on China's presence in Europe and in the Western Balkans. And being a researcher, I thought, you know, that I knew the facts, that I knew the story behind China's presence in the region and in Serbia as well. But I had no idea that the phases of the statistics that we actually use in our research look the way they look and the way they are presented in the film, because the Vietnamese workers that we mentioned, they have their faces. So through the film, you actually see the faces of the suffering, the human suffering that China's presence in the region could bring. Or for instance, the people that were filmed in Bor, the conditions, their fears, their everyday trauma, I would say, that is something that is not usually visible through our black letters on white paper, the analysis that we write. So that was what I really appreciated in the film.
Thanks very much, Anna. Kostas.
Let me also say that it is a pleasure to join this panel. So I have to say I'm really impressed by what Sam and his team produced, because the documentary actually navigates quite well an otherwise rather polarized discussion that is mostly captured by two extremes. So on the one hand, we have the win-win propaganda coming from Beijing. On the other hand, we have an exaggerated China threat perception that comes from very conservative circles in the US and the EU. And what is lost in that debate is exactly the perspective on the ground. So what does Chinese investment mean for, as you said, labor rights? I would also add for environmental protection. I would also add for the way we do business, for the integrity of our economies, for the rule of law in all these countries, right? So all these crucial aspects that involve in Chinese investment are not always in the front line of this discussion. And this documentary actually does a wonderful job in highlighting them.
Kostas, thanks very much. Stefan.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks to Bertelsmann Foundation and SIPA for inviting me and including me in this conversation tonight as well. I mean, not to repeat what has already been said, but I would, as someone coming from the Western Balkans and someone who actually, through the work of Foundation BFPE for Responsible Society organization that I'm part of, is actually traveling to the cities like Bor, Zrenjanin, actually a lot of familiar faces in the video that it is really good thing that you had included them in this conversation, because these are the people battling the impact on the ground. But for me, it is also eye-opening. Doesn't matter from which part of the world we are coming from, we often tend to position ourselves as a center of the universe. And just having people from the outside, the relevant experts that you have included in conversation as well, has showcased that this is not a unique case of the Chinese presence on the global level. Sam mentioned this and made a parallel to the Latin America. There is a template that China is being using, and understanding this template includes various level of perspectives that we are, looking through the ongoing processes. So that is another aspect of the movie that have really been important for understanding Chinese presence and using the Western Balkans as an example of processes. Maybe more important for Europe than some other parts of the world, but still equally important to understand what is actually China trying to achieve on a global level.
Maybe I want to pick up that point, Stefan, and go back to Kostas for a moment, because you mentioned this idea of a polarized debate. One thing that we don't see a lot of, for many reasons that Sam can get into later on, is the challenge of interviewing Chinese voices, Chinese officials, as part of this discussion to get a full picture. I don't put you in the unenviable position of trying to channel what the Chinese position might be. But if you were in Beijing and you're seeing this, what is your viewpoint on Serbia? What is the best case scenario that you can paint for what we've just seen here? Can you give us some sort of explanation that gives a more Chinese perspective to this discussion?
Well, unfortunately, as you very well know, in the last decade, we have seen a centralization of power. Essentially, China has become more dictatorial than it used to be. And that's for many different factors. So I don't think that there would be many Chinese officials going on record with any kind of views that deviate from the from the usual win-win kind of rhetoric. So, but I do think that there is a big difference in the way we approach development in areas such as Southeast Europe. So let's say a European perspective would be, okay, economic development, but also good governance, right? So we want to engage in development because we don't simply want to develop a certain project, but we also would like to see progress in terms of good governance overall. The Chinese perspective doesn't really care about that. And that's fair because it's a different mindset. There's quite a lot of emphasis on sovereignty, on really, at least on a superficial level, not interfering. There is interference, but different form of interference. So there are no conditionalities, let's say. So I think that their understanding would be more like, well, we both make money out of this. Everything else is the responsibility of the Serbian government to take care. And if I can add just a couple more lines, I would say that the line that captured my attention and I completely agree with in the documentary is the comment by David Lampton that China deals with governments and societies as it finds them. Chinese financing does not go to another country to improve the way the rule of law operates. Okay, so I think this is something that we really need to keep in mind when we are assessing both motives and also results on the ground.
Yeah, Kostas, thank you for that segue. Actually, I want to go back to Anna when it comes to motives and results. None of this happens in a vacuum, and I think Sam did a great job of putting this all into context. Kostas is talking about the Chinese connecting with governments and working with them as they find them. The European Union has a different set of standards in many cases, and one of the things the film touched on is the promises unkept, or at least certain expectations that haven't been met. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what the situation is in the EU vis-a-vis the Western Balkans, if you like, broadly, or Serbia more specifically. What does the outlook look like? And do you think that the EU has missed an opportunity? And is there any acknowledgement that that's actually the case? There's a lot of questions there, but it gives you plenty of room to run.
Yes, thank you for this question. I do think that at the time when Serbia started the engagement with China, and that is more or less the time when all the countries in the Western Balkans got closer to China, it was not because the EU was not there, because they did not have any accession prospects to join the EU. That was actually the time when Serbia and Montenegro started their accession talks. So many of these countries saw their relationship with China as somehow complementary to their EU accession. And in essence, it was complementary because it aimed to supply development financing, which would be in a way complementary to what the EU was doing. And it would help these countries to somehow bridge the gap in the EU accession, especially from the economic point of view. All these countries are much poorer. They have GDP per capita around 1/3 of the EU's average. So if they want to join the EU, they all need to implement a bunch of reforms related to rule of law, good governance, democracy, human rights, but also catch up in economic terms. And in the past decade, what we saw is that these countries failed to implement these reforms. And on the other side, the EU started to look more and more reluctant to integrate these countries. And I think that the film rightfully points out to a bunch of crises that happened in the meantime, the economic and sovereign debt crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, etc. And somehow enlargement policy, which used to be one of the most successful policies for the EU, got lost in all these crises. And these countries started to really lose their perspective. They started to lose the focus on the reforms. The political elites found themselves in a very cozy situation, saying we are not going to join the EU anytime soon, so really there is no rush to implement all these reforms. And this was some sort of a vicious circle, because if we do not implement these reforms, then the EU is really not willing to integrate these countries. And finally, in addition to all this, there is something that is usually called enlargement fatigue. What it actually means is that including these countries in the EU will have an impact on how the EU is functioning. It will have an impact on the budget, on how the budget is distributed, because these are all countries that are much poorer and are likely to be net beneficiaries of the EU budget, contrary to some countries like, I don't know, the Netherlands or Denmark that are net contributors. So when you have countries that are highly corrupt, as is the case with the Western Balkans, how can you explain to the Dutch or the Danish taxpayers that they need to integrate these countries and provide them indirectly with transfers from Denmark, Netherlands, and other countries through the EU budget to support the economic development of these countries? And finally, and in relation to Serbia and what it is doing with China, but also with Russia, it is already difficult at the level of the EU to reach decisions when you have 27 members. Can you imagine how it would look like to reach decisions in the area of foreign policy, where you have unanimity or consensus, when you have 36 member states, Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and when you have countries which have foreign policy like the Serbian one? Will the EU ever be able to reach a consensus and do something vis-a-vis Russia or vis-a-vis China? So I think that these are all the questions that somehow weigh on the EU's decision to integrate these countries. And we certainly all hope that this will happen sooner rather than later. But I don't think that being in this vicious circle, it is realistically to think that it will happen anytime soon.
Thanks, Anna. And I appreciate, we've had some questions come in from the audience, which I'll pepper in throughout this discussion as we go. First, I want to go to Stefan, though. Stefan, there's been a couple of mentions about politics here. Obviously, it's at the core of what we're talking about in the film. Also, Anna mentioned the human aspect of things, that there's a face to all of this. And I wonder if you could give us a view on the ground of what the political spectrum looks like at the moment in Serbia, and how does China factor in? How do these projects that are promised and either successful or fail, whether we're talking about EU integration as another element, how do all these various elements from outside impact the political spectrum on the individual voting level in Serbia?
Thank you for that question, and I will actually misuse the opportunity and very briefly and shortly answer the questions from the Q&A, because it is one sentence per question. When it comes to the Zrenjanin Vesel power factory, it is completely greenfield investment, which means that Chinese will be owning Linglong 100% as long as they want to own it and to operate in Zrenjanin and in Serbia. When it comes to the copper exploitation, one of the things that Serbian politicians decision makers have been bragging with is the increase of export towards the Chinese market. One of the reasons behind it is that the export of copper and other ores that have been extracted from Zijin mines have been 10 to 12 times enlarged the overall amount of the export of those ores from Serbia to China. So it is pretty plain exploitation of natural resources. So the overall profit finally goes to the Chinese companies in Serbia, to the Chinese market, because it gets its resources. But it is also worth mentioning that around 30% of the ownership of Zijin mines are still under the control of the Serbian government. So that is to answer those questions. When it comes to the political spectrum, it is very important to mention one thing, and that is that China did not come to Serbia with Aleksandar Vučić stepping to the power. China came to Serbia with the agreements that have been signed by the previous government and the previous leaders led by Boris Tadić and Vuk Jeremić, who are both now one of the more prominent leaders of the opposition. That came as the attempts of Serbian government in 2008 to 2009 to find new partners that would help Serbia to overcome the financial crisis, but also to dispute the Kosovo independence, which has been proclaimed in 2008. So I'm mentioning this because in the political spectrum, talking about the political parties, there is pretty much a consensus that cooperation with China is useful, with one or two exceptions. And it is interesting that some of the people that you have included in the movie are prominent political activists, either through political parties or on the local level, but they are pretty much all of them are accommodated or connected within the party led by Dragan Đilas, former mayor of Belgrade. Still, for example, one of the vice presidents of that party is the chair of the National Parliament Committee on Foreign Affairs, and when the parliamentarian delegation of the CCP visited Belgrade a couple of months ago, he was one chairing the meeting, saying that he looks to expanding the cooperation between Serbia and China. So I would say that there is no clear vision within the Serbian political opposition to combat rising Chinese influences. Two reasons are behind it. First, China has significant popularity and positive view among the wider Serbian population. So current public polls are showing between 70 and 80% of citizens seeing China as a beneficial partner for Serbia, which means that if you are tackling politically China, it is not really smart thing to do, because most of the people are perceiving China as a friendly country. The second thing is that the amount of the loans that Serbia has taken from China bidens Serbia to China for the next at least 15 years, which means that if you want to come to power, position of power in the next 15 years, you will have to deal with China, and you will have to deal with the Chinese loans and the cooperation with the Chinese companies that are present here in Serbia. And finally, I will finish with this. I would argue that before 2020, China was quite irrelevant for the wider population and the wider discussion among foreign policy aspects that are important to the citizens of Serbia. But in the COVID pandemic and popularity that China gained through promotion by the Serbian government leaders and the decision makers, China and Xi Jinping really became household names. So now talking in favor of China has become politically beneficial for political parties, meaning that is one of the reasons why we are hearing zero to none criticism, relevant criticism, except from the local activists, independent journalists, and not even that many experts coming from the think tank.
I want to pick up on that point, Kostas. You know, one day the bill is going to come due, and whether we're talking about the economic bill or the environmental bill, it's coming one day. And I'm curious, how sensitive to those issues do you imagine that Serbian politics will be, that voters will be, when they start sensing that, you know, their economic prospects are in trouble because now we've got to go through austerity measures in order to service these loans? The environmental degradation reaches a point where it's unsustainable. Talk to me about what that looks like on the ground once the bill comes due.
Well, I see three main areas where Chinese investment has a indirect negative impact, and perhaps the indirect impact is more negative than the direct. First of all, is the delay to decarbonization. So when you have so much supply of coal-based technologies from China, and you don't have a strong regulatory context, or you don't have any kind of government commitments to decarbonization, this means that essentially you immunize any kind of pressure coming from the EU or from any European institutions. So one is refers to the environment. The second refers to disincentives for not simply joining the EU, but aligning regulations and laws with European regulations and laws. Because essentially, Chinese investment, in the same manner as Russian investment in the region, can help politicians who are not real reformists basically delay everything. And this, of course, will, as you said, will result in sooner rather than later, citizens receiving a very kind of a bill that they will not like. Now, there is also a third aspect, a third indirect impact that I find very problematic. And this has to do primarily with the quality of politics, with the quality of rule of law. And that is that Chinese investment essentially comes with a political package that is not Chinese per se, but it undermines democracy. And this, of course, gives more space for Russian influence, right, to sustain its presence in the region. So I see this kind of synergies between Chinese money and Russian kind of political influence being particularly problematic in the region.
There are two audience questions that I wanted to see if I could tackle with you, Anna. First is there was a question about whether the movie would be available after the fact. It will be available at some point in the relatively near future. So look to us, and if you want to shoot us an email at info.bfna.org, we can try to get a link to you to the film if you missed it. So thank you for that question. Anna, I wanted to come back to two things here. One, I think, is a question we just got recently while Kostas was talking, so I think it sparked this question, and that's about alternatives to Chinese investment. What do you see out there? What can be done that is actually a viable alternative to the circumstances that were painted in this documentary film?
First of all, I really appreciated Sam's approach in the beginning when he said that this is not a black and white picture, and we're not trying to portray everything that China is doing as being black. So I really don't see why there should be why we should be speaking about an alternative to Chinese investments. I don't think that we are saying that there should not be Chinese investments to the Western Balkans, especially if these investments come in the form that they should be, you know, with the respect of all the relevant national legislation and EU legislation, because we are, after all, candidates for EU membership. So I don't think that Chinese investments should be barred or should be completely unwelcome in the Western Balkans. But I think that we should, as civil society, put pressure on the national governments to ensure that when these investments do come, they create benefits for the national economy and the local communities, and that the negative aspects that we saw, like huge pollution, corruption, etc., are eliminated or at least minimized. This is about the commercial investments or the FDI. And then when it comes to loans or development financing, these concessional loans that China has been providing to most of the countries in the Western Balkans, with the exception of Albania and Kosovo, the only alternative that I see to these loans is EU funding. And it does come to the region in the form of the instrument for pre-accession. But if these countries become members of the EU, this funding would be 10 times higher. At the current rate, it is not sufficient to support the infrastructural development, building highways, railways, and other big infrastructure projects. So given that many of these countries are near to the limit of 60% that GDP ratio, as according to the EU rules, they will probably have limited space for contracting new loans, whether we are talking about China or even other international or European lenders. But the only alternative that they could have, which would come in the form of grant or interest-free loans, is supposed to come from the EU and from the EU structural funds.
Thanks, Anna. I want to bring in one more question from the audience. I see we've got just a few minutes remaining together, and it's a question about trying to compare different continents and the public reception to investment from China. Is there anybody who can speak broadly, as we sort of zoom out to the global view here? We touched on the film on Latin America, on Africa. Sam, I look to you as well, but would anybody like to jump in on making a compare and contrast on public reception to Chinese investment?
Well, if I may add a couple of things, and maybe to put it under the framework, for example, one of the most prominent Chinese policies, and those are the current Chinese policies, and that is the policy of territorial integrity. It is a rising question for the international community as well, because it is not only pointing towards the Chinese position on the territorial integrity of the mainland China in relations to the question of Taiwan, but is also sending the message towards the world and finding the partners who will support that issue. Just recently in Latin America, we have had the withdrawal of the recognition of Taiwan as an independent country. The number of the diplomatic relations that Taiwan has established has been decreasing, and that actually shows that down the road, the narratives that Chinese will be pushing will be more and more prominent in those areas. Whether we are talking about Africa, we have recently heard comments that when some of the Europeans or US officials have been visiting Africa, they were pointing towards, the dependence that Africa has, some of the African countries has towards the Chinese lenders and investments, and the African response was, why are you always coming here talking about China? Let's talk about what you can do for us, not to talk about what someone else is already doing. So when you have a rising power like China is right now, someone would debate already a superpower, trying to launch a new view on how the global system of governance should work, then having these kind of approaches across the world can create a bond and can create a coalition of interested partners who would support that kind of narrative. And we are witnessing that already happening in certain issues, in certain areas. And if it continues to expand like this, it is to be seen in the post-COVID pandemic, what will the level of the developmental help that China has been providing in their way will be, whether it will reach the level of pre-COVID, post-COVID, then we can see and follow whether the trajectory of launching narratives from the Chinese perspectives, get more and more accepted on the global scale as well.
Thanks, Stefan. What I want to do in our remaining time together is I've got one more question I'd like to go around the horn. And then Sam, I'd like to give the last word to you. I've got one final question for you as well. And I noticed in the film and in some of the reading that I've been doing for this session, Vučić spent a lot of time in his victory speech, unsurprisingly, talking about the future. And so I wanted to end the conversation with, we do a lot of forecasting at the Bertelsmann Foundation, looking ahead. If Serbia follows the same trajectory that it's on right now, I'd love for you to forecast for us and paint a picture of what you think Serbia is going to look like. Let's make it simple. Let's call it, well, relatively simple. Let's call it 5 years down the line. Give us your best depiction of what you think we're about to see from Serbia. Anna, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you. I think that 5 years is a pretty short term to see any meaningful changes, because as Stefan already mentioned, Serbia's China policy was not developed or initiated by Vučić. Maybe it was shaped in a way by President Vučić, but then it was essentially a consensus that China would be one of the 4 pillars of Serbia's foreign policy. And given the large support that China enjoys in Serbia, I think I would rather go with the status quo option. So I don't think that we are likely to see changes in Serbia's foreign policy towards China in the 5 years term.
Thanks, Anna. I'm going to take moderator privilege and then change the rules of the game based on Anna's comments and extend out to 15 years. For you, Kostas, what do you think?
I'm not an expert of Serbian politics, but what I can definitely say is that Chinese commitment to its investments is long term. And that's a big difference between private Western investment that can be very mobile, and exactly because the main aspect there is, to satisfy shareholders, it can move around a lot. But what we see with Chinese investment, and by Chinese investment, of course, we mean state capital, right? The state capital, they are here to stay. So I wouldn't be surprised if in 15 years' time, we have the same and possibly larger scale of Chinese investment in Serbia as well as in the region. Hopefully, as the other speaker said, this investment will be better regulated and better aligned with European laws and regulations.
Thanks, Kostas. Stefan, what do you think?
As Anna mentioned, at some point, Serbian foreign policy was mentioned, and foreign policy built on 4 pillars. At some point, Serbian foreign policy got reiterated as a multi-vectoral foreign policy because other actors got included as well. And Serbian foreign policy often tends to get formulated as the winds blow. So I would say that it is not only the case of what will be the Chinese interest in the region or in Serbia, or what would be the Serbian interest or the Chinese, but what will also be the other geopolitical and also economic factors influencing the Serbian foreign policy decisions. What will not change as long as Vučić is in power is that he will take every opportunity to gain advantage on the domestic level, but also that means that he has to present himself to the Europeans as a European, to the Americans as someone who is supporting US position on some of the issues that are currently burdening not only the region, but also on the global level. The same goes for other actors as well. So depending on the developments on the global level, Serbian foreign policy can be adjusted. And I will just point one thing, it is very serious conversation, although many watchers, Balkan watchers, are not seeing it like that. There is a very serious conversation whether Vučić is already distancing itself from Russia at a certain point, a certain capacity. My personal point of view is that Vučić has never actually been a pro-Russian leader. He is someone who has cooperated with Russia in the certain areas on a very intensive level, but that the current situation where he is put under the spot because of the Russian aggression in Ukraine has created a very uncomfortable position towards him. So I would personally not be surprised if we see in a reasonable amount of time down the road further Serbian distancing from the official Russian policies, which would tentatively means also a little bit more alignment with those 50 to 60% of the foreign policy decisions made by European Union. I just want to finish with that it should be 100 in Serbia. 100% in Serbia is around 50%.
Thanks, Stefan. And Sam, I want to come to you with the last question before I close up shop for the day. And that's really what you want the audience to take away from all this. Talk to me about what you think you'd like the audience to come away with.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say what a fascinating conversation that was. A really, really fantastic contributions from the panelists. So thank you very much. I mean, it's such a complicated topic that I think we need to understand that it's happening and what it means and what these regions need. I mean, one thing we keep coming back to is the lack of alternative. You see that in a lot of the questions too, that if the EU is going to be absent and the World Bank is going to be absent and the United States is going to be absent, these countries want to develop and that's within their rights to want to do so. So I think that it's a wake-up call that if you're sitting in Washington in the State Department and you're concerned about this, then hey, you better get more involved in the region. And same goes for Brussels. I think it was also really appreciate from this conversation the fact that China didn't invade Serbia and take the copper mine. That it really is important to highlight the same thing that Kostas highlighted is that as China is engaging with these countries at the level that it finds them, and these countries are inviting China in and making these deals. So it's also about holding local leaders accountable and trying to promote transparency there for its sake. So, I mean, I think, and it's difficult to hold a nuanced conversation in these highly polarized times, but it's fundamentally important that we do so. And so, what do I want to get out of this? Exactly what we got today. This was such a cool conversation, and I appreciate sharing it with this audience, and I appreciate the panelists for their contributions.
Thanks very much, Sam. So with that, I want to conclude today's event. I want to begin by thanking our partners at SIPA for their collaboration. Always wonderful working with you all. To Anna, Kostas, Stefan, Sam, thank you all very much for a great conversation today, and I hope you'll join us when we all get together again